January 31, 1945. American pilots stand around a captured Japanese bomber on a dusty airfield in the Pacific. They've been fighting these planes for years, watching them light up like Roman candles whenever bullets found their mark. But now, seeing one up close for the first time, they're about to discover something that changes everything they thought they knew about their enemy. One pilot reaches out and touches the fuel tank. No armor plating, no self-sealing rubber. Just thin aluminum between thousands of gallons of high-octane fuel and certain death. And suddenly, a chilling question emerges. Why would anyone design a plane like this? The Mitsubishi G4M, called the Betty bomber by Allied forces, had terrorized the Pacific since 1941. Fast, long-range, and deadly when it reached its target. American fighter pilots had a different name for it, though. They called it the Flying Lighter, or the one-shot lighter. Hit it once, anywhere, and it would likely explode into flames. But standing there on that January afternoon in 1945, examining the real thing instead of shooting at it, the American technical team couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. These weren't amateurs building these planes. Japanese engineering was sophisticated, precise, innovative in so many ways. The Betty could fly over 3,700 miles without refueling, an incredible range that most Allied bombers couldn't match. Its engines were powerful and reliable. The aerodynamics were actually quite elegant. So why this? Why leave the fuel tanks completely exposed? Captain James Wheeler, one of the evaluation pilots that day, would later write in his report, "It's as if they designed the perfect bomber, then forgot to protect the men flying it." Or worse, as if they didn't care. That second possibility haunted him. Because if it was intentional, it revealed something about Japanese military philosophy that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The Betty wasn't an anomaly. As American forces captured more Japanese aircraft and equipment throughout 1944 and 1945, a pattern emerged that puzzled Western military analysts. The famous Zero fighter, unmatched in maneuverability early in the war, also had no armor protection for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. The same was true for the Oscar, the Hayabusa, even some of their newer designs. American and British planes, by contrast, were flying tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress could take incredible punishment and still bring its crew home. Allied fighters had armored seats, bulletproof windscreens, fuel tanks that could seal themselves when punctured. Yes, these protections added weight and reduced performance, but the calculus seemed obvious. Dead pilots can't win wars. But Japan had made a different calculation entirely. And standing in front of that Betty bomber, the American engineers began to understand the brutal logic behind it. Admiral Yamamoto himself had reportedly said, "The fate of the empire rests on this war. We must sink the enemy's carriers." Every pound of armor removed meant more fuel, more range, more payload. In those early days of the war, when Japan was on the offensive, the Betty's extraordinary range had been a devastating advantage. They could strike targets Allied forces thought were safely out of reach. The Betty bomber that sank the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in December 1941 had flown from bases in Vietnam hundreds of miles away. It was a feat British commanders thought impossible. Until it wasn't. But strategies that work in offense often fail in defense. By 1945, Japan was losing. Badly. And the very design philosophy that gave them early advantages had become a death sentence. One captured Japanese pilot, when asked about the Betty's vulnerability, simply said through a translator, "We knew." We all knew. American intelligence officers interviewing Japanese aircrews heard the same stories repeatedly. Pilots watching their wingmen explode from a single tracer round. Crews who survived getting hit describing the terror of flying a bomb that could detonate at any moment. Some Betty crews reportedly wore parachutes even on takeoff, so convinced were they that they wouldn't make it to the target. The mathematics were stark. By mid-war, Betty bomber squadrons were experiencing casualty rates above 50% on some missions. Not shot down, just casualties. meaning more than half the planes sent out either didn't return or returned so damaged they'd never fly again. And yet they kept flying them, kept building them. Even as American fighters with heavier armament and better tactics learned exactly where to aim. Even as the skies filled with more and more Allied aircraft. The strategic decision made years earlier had locked them into a doctrine they couldn't escape. Here's where the story gets complicated. Because it would be easy to look at the Betty bomber and see only foolishness or fatalism. But the reality is more nuanced. When Japan designed these aircraft in the late 1930s, they were facing an impossible problem. They lacked America's industrial capacity, its access to raw materials, its seemingly infinite ability to build and rebuild. They couldn't match the Allies plane for plane, ship for ship, tank for tank. So they had to be better, faster, longer ranged. They had to strike first and strike hard. It's also true that Japanese military culture placed enormous emphasis on offensive spirit, on accepting risk, on the willingness to die for the mission. This wasn't just propaganda, it was woven into the training, the tactics, the entire philosophy of warfare. A pilot who worried about his own survival before completing the mission was considered to have failed before he even took off. But here's what makes this so tragic. By the time that captured Betty sat on that airfield in January 1945, the war was already lost. Japan's industrial capacity was shattered. They couldn't replace the pilots they were losing. Every mission was sending young men to their deaths in planes that had been designed with a war plan that no longer existed. The American pilots examining that Betty bomber couldn't have known they were looking at a physical manifestation of a nation's strategic desperation. They couldn't have known that within 7 months, the war would end not through conventional bombing, but through weapons that would make every debate about armor plating and fuel tank protection feel almost quaint by comparison. But what they did understand, standing there in the Pacific heat, touching those unprotected fuel tanks, was this: somewhere in the gap between brilliant engineering and fatal vulnerability lay a profound lesson about the nature of war itself. Wars aren't won by the bravest soldiers or the most dedicated pilots. They're won by the side that can afford to protect its people, that has the resources to value survival as much as victory, that can build weapons designed not just to destroy the enemy, but to bring its warriors home. The Betty bomber was fast, elegant, and deadly to its enemies and to its crew in equal measure. It represented a military philosophy that accepted extraordinary sacrifice in pursuit of strategic goals. And in the end, it became a symbol of something else entirely: the human cost of fighting a war you cannot win, in planes designed for a reality that no longer exists. That American pilot was right. They had designed the perfect bomber for the war they wanted to fight. They just couldn't protect the men flying it in the war they got instead. If you found this story fascinating, there are dozens more like it, where military technology reveals uncomfortable truths about strategy, sacrifice, and survival. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.